Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Coming up on the program, a plan to make State Street work for the future. The debate over health care and Medicare for All is a hot topic among presidential contenders. A look inside the Black Creativity exhibit as it celebrates 50 years. And Geoffrey Bear on the gritty history of a now trendy Chicago neighborhood. But first tonight, new details are emerging about a Chicago casino proposal. Mayor Lightfoot spent part of the week in Springfield lobbying lawmakers to approve a bill that would ease up on some of the casino taxes and fees. Paris Schutt sat down for a one-on-one with the mayor today to talk about that topic, the stalled Obama Center, violence, and more. Paris, what did you learn from the mayor?
Well, Brandis, this new casino proposal would spread out the cost that a Chicago casino would have to pay over 6 years. This is a 75% reconciliation fee. Under current law, all the new casinos have to pay this in 2 years, so giving them a little more time to pay this very onerous cost. And she says under current law, Chicago casino just isn't going to be built because no developer is going to take a chance with taxes like that. So to change the law, her challenge is to get downstate lawmakers on board with her. How does she do that? She has to convince them something is in it for them. So for one, there's $800 million in estimated tax revenue to the state's capital bill that would come from a Chicago casino. The state currently isn't getting that.
The reality is about $1 billion in vertical capital depends upon revenue generated by a Chicago casino. So we believe that there's more than a compelling statewide case to get this done. So there's a lot of wins for people all over the state. I'm grateful for the support of Representative Jay Hoppin, who's a downstater who is going to make that case. And I think we'll see other downstaters also stand up and say, yes, this is good for Illinois.
Another selling point in the plan that she gave lawmakers is Chicago casino would pay higher taxes than nearly every other casino in the state, and it would do about $1.2 billion in revenue. So she says these are all reasons that everybody in Illinois, whether they're downstate or suburban, should get on board. Another issue on her agenda in Springfield, a graduated real estate transfer tax where higher income properties would pay more in taxes when they're sold. Lightfoot is banking on this to plug $100 million in budget deficits over the next several years. She does not support a bill that's currently proposed in Springfield to deal with this because that bill would mandate that $70 million of new revenue in this proposal would go directly toward homelessness.
You want me to take $70 million off the table when we've got a structural budget deficit for every conceivable year into the future. Can you tell me where I'm going to get that $70 million? Can you explain to all the advocates for things like affordable housing, mental health, violence reduction, why it is that one issue should be elevated over all others and get an income stream in perpetuity in the multiple tens of millions of dollars? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Now, Paris, there is still contention over whether the city should sign an agreement with neighbors around the proposed Obama Presidential Center to prevent displacement. What does she say about that?
Well, right. There was that sit-in last week at City Hall. Brandis, she met with President Obama during All-Star Weekend, NBA All-Star Weekend. She does not support an ordinance that's on the table proposed by 20th Ward Alderman Jeanette Taylor that would mandate 30% of new housing in that area be set aside for affordable housing. Also, it would mandate a fund to help some residents offset some costs. She says there is a better way than that.
A lot of things in there that don't fit with, I think, the law. There's some questions about what's the price tag for it. None of it's been priced out. And if anybody knows anything about me, I am going to be a very dogged fiscal fiduciary. I'm not just going to pander to the crowd. I need to know what things are going to cost. And we don't have a lot of answers to some of the things that are in ordinance.
Paris, there was also a presidential debate last night. Is Mayor Lightfoot weighing in there?
I heard about that.
Did you hear about that? I didn't know.
Yeah.
Is Mayor Lightfoot weighing in?
She has weighed in. She has spoken positively about New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg in the past. She's met with him. Rumors are that she would endorse him. I asked her if controversies with stop and frisk and his comments about women give her pause.
I have concerns about stop and frisk. I've made no secret about that. I have concerns about the comments that are now coming to light about the things that he said over time about women. But I try to look at these things in the broadest possible context. I also know he, like others, have empowered a lot of women to hold important positions in city government, in his philanthropy, in his businesses. But he's got a lot to answer for.
So clearly not offering her official endorsement there. She said she might not endorse before the March 17th Illinois primary. Now, our interview today took place during the Solutions Toward Ending Poverty Summit, an initiative organized by the mayor's office to help crystallize a plan to eradicate poverty in Chicago in 10 years. You're going to hear more about that in a second. And the problem is serious. City statistics show that 1 in 5 Chicagoans are living below the poverty level, and Lightfoot says it's an issue that affects the other 4/5 of the city just as much.
Poverty has a high cost for all of us. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not money that's being spent by somebody else. It affects the entirety of us, not only in our city budget and taxes that are raised to address the manifestations of poverty and lack of investment, but it also affects where private capital is invested. So we all literally and figuratively are in this together.
And there's lots more in this interview online, including her reaction to the high violence numbers this year.
Okay, Paris, thank you. And now to Phil Ponce with more on that summit on ending poverty. Phil.
Brad, as Charles Dickens wrote about it, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about it, and Lyndon B. Johnson tried to end it. As Paris just noted, poverty was front and center at a summit hosted today by Mayor Lightfoot at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Local policymakers, union leaders, employers, and academics focused on how to end poverty in Chicago within a generation. That is the mayor's goal. With 22% of Chicagoans now living in poverty, is that goal really achievable? Here to share their insights on this ongoing challenge are Dan Lurie. He's policy director for Mayor Lightfoot. Dan Lurie is heading up the mayor's poverty agenda. Teresa Cordova, director of the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is also chairperson of the Chicago Plan Commission. And Elizabeth Todd Breland, associate professor of history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And welcome all to Chicago tonight. Dan Lurie, the mayor, says she wants to end poverty in Chicago within a generation. Some people have said that's a pretty ambitious goal. Expand on what it is she wants exactly.
So she has a couple goals in mind to get to that ultimate success outcome. One is she wants to move immediately city investments to start addressing the symptoms of poverty. How can we mitigate the harm that we know is out there, the suffering that and the hardship that is out there? Two is she wants to have a very different kind of policy process. And if for folks who tuned in today were able to watch on our live stream, what you saw was a conversation about how we can engage and really center community in the policy development process. And then three is we want to make sure that we are clear about what success looks like and develop a plan together with residents, with employers, with academics and researchers, so that we are all transparent and on the same page, quite literally, about where we go. That's going to be the next stage of the work, is to develop that.
Elizabeth Todd Breland, you looked at today, you led a discussion that looked more on how it is the city got here. You looked at the history of Chicago and how it contributed to the poverty, to poverty in the city. What are some of the main points that came out during your discussion?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the main takeaways is that poverty is not a new problem here in the city, particularly racialized poverty. And if you look over time, there have been various ways that the capitalist economy has created poverty and exploitation of workers in the industrial era in the 19th century, in the 20th century, even in a booming economy, the way that policies were put in place that were discriminatory, and now in our service sector economy, where we increasingly see a small group of people making a lot of money and a vast part of our population, largely black and brown, working at the bottom of the service sector economy.
Are you speaking specifically about Chicago? Because the things you're talking about sound like they apply to society at large.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think Chicago is part of the larger conversation, but there are some Chicago-specific things, policies that have been put in place historically, ways that Chicago has gone further, in fact, than other places. You know, we're one of the most segregated cities in the country. I think that means that the way that things happen in here matter not just for Chicago, but for the nation, really.
Teresa Cordova, is there a primary driver of poverty in Chicago, or is it connected in large part to what some people assert has been institutional racism?
Well, and I think that Elizabeth is exactly right in saying that poverty isn't new to Chicago, and poverty is clearly related to increased disparities in wealth, of which we've been seeing a great deal over the last few decades. But one of the things I think is really important to understand poverty in Chicago is it's very much related to the decline of the manufacturing sector and its impact on job loss. So, for example, at the height of manufacturing in Chicago, we had about 667,000 jobs in Chicago, and by 2014, that number was only a little over 110,000. And Blacks and Latinos, for example, the large percentages of their population have been employed in manufacturing. So when manufacturing was in decline, a lot of them then lost opportunities for employment. And we also know that in manufacturing, wages were higher. So not only was there job loss, but there was job loss in higher paying industries.
Dan Lurie, some of these forces whereby once upon a time Chicago had in excess of 600,000 manufacturing jobs, now just over 100,000 or so. Those are forces that exist and are at play throughout the country. What steps has the mayor already taken to deal with this, particularly pockets of poverty?
Sure. So we've taken a few steps. One is we have sped up the minimum wage increase to $15 to 2021 and expanded the folks who are covered by that. And wages are a huge part of driving people into poverty, not surprisingly. The people's income, of course, needs to go up. Two is we've instituted the Fair Work Week legislation, which gives people predictable scheduling, especially low-wage workers, so that when you have a job, you can keep it and not worry that scheduling for childcare, arranging for family pickup will cause you to lose your job. Then three, we are working on addressing the kind of what we call wealth stripping, the city and other factors who are using relatively benign practices like parking ticket collection that have actual effects of taking money from mostly black and brown low-income communities. We want to make sure that we don't do that, we stop doing that, and that we figure out how we can get more progressive revenue collection practices, because the mayor's fundamental belief is that we need to grow our way out of this. We are not going to do this by shifting things around. We need to really think about a new growth strategy that's inclusive and not a trickle-down approach that the city has usually used, which has trickled down, and that trickle is just insufficient to get to the problem.
Elizabeth Todd Breland, my understanding is you also have some other suggestions regarding policies which have to do with how government interacts with its citizens. For example, you are a proponent, or at least of putting on the table the whole notion of a standard basic income. Explain how that would help.
Yeah, I mean, the problem of poverty is a problem of people not having money. So give people money. I mean, this is something that hasn't just been put forth. I've come out of an education background since the 1960s in the Coleman Report. People have said, listen, you are not going to educate people out of poverty. Their family income is something that is directly related to how students perform in schools, for example. So I think that's one of many things that we need to think about seriously. I do think, in addition, redistributing the wealth that already exists through different forms of taxation. You know, right now there's the fair tax proposal at the state level. There are other things that people have suggested. But one of the
governor's progressive tax proposals,
correct,
is what you're referring to.
But I think another thing that we see is that at a time, to Teresa's point, a unionized workforce where people were able to have a quality standard of living, where they could pay a living wage both from the private sector but also in public sector jobs, which have disproportionately, black people have been represented disproportionately at high levels in the public sector. So the cutting back in both of those areas has had really catastrophic effects on our communities.
Teresa Cordova, what would your recommended approach be to look at the pockets of poverty that exist in large part on the south side and on the west side, or kind of a more general approach that, for want of a better term, lifts all boats?
We do have to concentrate in the areas where the poverty is greatest, because that's one of the things that's interesting about Chicago and poverty in Chicago is that it is very concentrated. We did a hardship index, for example, a few years back, showing that in certain neighborhoods, the west and south side, for example, southwest side, that the hardship index is considerably higher than what it is, for example, in some of the north side neighborhoods. And one of the things that we then can learn from that is that poverty needs to be understood in the context of the neighborhoods themselves. So it's partly bringing back the neighborhoods, bringing back the anchor institutions within those neighborhoods and opportunities that come with strong, vital neighborhoods.
Dan Lurie, the mayor, said that she wasn't expecting a cure for poverty to come out of this this day-long gathering that you had, but she was hoping, or she was expecting, a framework. Do you have one?
We have a framework for our policy work, the city's investments. What we want to do now is go out, listen to folks, and actually get, I think both my panelists here have raised the point that how poverty manifests, in fact, is not something the city has a good handle on. In fact, really no government does. So we know income needs to grow. We know that public health needs to improve, especially to address racial life disparities. We know that we need to stop doing harm and taking money from folks and get them money that they need. But how we do that and what that looks like in a particular community is the project that rolls forward. And we want to do that in partnership with residents, in partnership with the institutions that are really in many ways the government in their communities. That is a long-term project that begins now. And so we are going to undertake a few months of what we call active listening. How can we get out and actually ask people, where is your struggle? Where is your pain point? We know some fundamentals, but there's a lot we don't know. We don't want to presume that we have a plan that will guide us for 20 years when we know that residents can inform us, especially residents living in hardship, who are the best experts on what poverty is and how we can address it. So we want to get that information before we roll out a plan.
The Bible famously asserts that the poor will always be with us. What do you say to skeptics who think, okay, getting rid of poverty in Chicago within a generation, nice dream, good luck? Response to the cynics?
Well, you know, one of the reasons why I think it's definitely a goal that we should achieve, and what it suggests is a sort of an all hands on deck and really this concentrated, integrated effort, right, where there's a lot of collaborations. But the difficulty of doing it within one generation is there have been so many, continue to be so many impacts of poverty, for example, on children. The impact, someone spoke today, for example, the impact on the brain of poverty. And there's a trauma that gets associated with not having enough income in the house, the stress that gets associated with that. So in the meantime, one of the things we need to do as we're alleviating it is to make sure that we have adequate social safety nets. And whether that means access to child care, assistance for the parents, food stamps, various kinds of forms of subsidies. The social safety nets really need to be part of this strategy, because one of the things that accompanied the deindustrialization was the retrenchment of the public sector, and we can't give that up.
That's where we'll have to leave it. Dan Lurie, Teresa Cordova, and Elizabeth Todd Breland, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
And we're back with more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
Every year, millions of people visit State Street in the heart of Chicago's Loop. But instead of hurrying to the office or going to get a bite to eat, what if you stopped and asked, is this street working the way it should? As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg tells us, that's the question the Chicago Loop Alliance is asking, part of its plan to create a vision for what State Street could be.
Designing the State Street of the future isn't a new idea. In the 1970s, in an effort to revive the central business district, the city decided to turn it into a pedestrian and transit mall.
No private traffic, no taxis, no private cars, nothing.
By the mid-90s, the State Street Mall was seen as a well-intentioned flop. The idea was to try and compete with the shopping district on North Michigan Avenue and with sprawling suburban malls.
But you can look at what we have right here and we can call this a mall, but it was truly never a mall. It was a transit mall.
Malls in major urban areas never work with this concept. And as mayor, it's very difficult to find out who proposed it.
Your dad, for starters, but anyway. In 1996, the city reopened State to traffic and kicked off a street-level redesign. That redesign brought new lampposts and subway entrances, designed with an eye toward the city's history. Plus, flowers and shrubs brought a touch of greenery to the loop, especially in the summertime. And the plan basically worked. State Street was once again that great street. Sorry. But as more residents move into downtown and shopping and transportation patterns change, the Chicago Loop Alliance, which handles much of the daily management of state at the street level, says it's time to rethink things again.
It's becoming increasingly costly for us to maintain the street to the condition that people are used to. And so we're interested to see if there's some other things that we could do that might make it more sustainable into the future.
At the Loop Alliance Foundation's annual meeting Thursday morning, members heard about the new Elevate State Plan from Ernie Wong. He's principal of the urban landscape architecture firm Site, hired to lead the project. Some key elements the plan will consider: how people get around on State and what the infrastructure looks like.
The center median, if you think about it, on State Street currently houses a lot of parking for city vehicles, and can that be used in a much better way?
And can retail on State take a cue from places like the Starbucks Roastery and rethink brick and mortar stores?
People want to walk into a store, find an experience, and then they'll purchase something at that point, whether it's in the store or online.
It's a big plan, but then so is this stretch of State.
It's almost a mile long, it's very vertical, it's very wide. And so I think things that we can add to the street that kind of bring that scale down a little bit would be important.
During his presentation, Wong shouted out public spaces like Paseo Bandera in Santiago, Chile, Superkilen in Copenhagen, Denmark. He says they're inspirations, but not the model.
I think we'd like to make State Street the model for other places.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
The Elevate State Plan includes a series of workshops throughout the spring and summer. The plan is scheduled to be released at the end of the year, and you can find out more on our website. Another familiar name caught up in a federal indictment. Paris Schutz has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago Tonight. Paris.
That's right, Brandis. Casey Urlacher, brother of former Bears linebacker Brian Urlacher, has been charged in a federal indictment for allegedly running an illegal offshore sports gambling ring. Urlacher is mayor of the village of Medawa in Lake County and a former Republican candidate for the Illinois Senate. The indictment alleges he recruited bettors for the gambling ring in exchange for a cut of their losses. Prosecutors say the leader of the operation was an Orland Park resident named Vincent Delgaitis, who went by the name Uncle Mick. 9 other people were named in this indictment, including a Chicago police officer named Nicholas Stella. Chicago Sun-Times is reporting that Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan has been named in a new federal subpoena. That subpoena is part of a reported probe into ComEd's lobbying activities. It focuses on a Madigan political worker named Raymond Nice, who worked as a contractor for the village of Marionette Park. The subpoena asked the village to turn over any communication with Madigan, as well as former advisors and aides Michael McLean and Timothy Mapes, among others. Disgraced former Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson is set to receive a monthly pension of almost $16,000, according to a new report by the Chicago Tribune. Johnson will receive 75% of his average salary of his final 4 years with CPD, amounting to nearly $190,000 every year for the rest of his life. Johnson was fired late last year by Mayor Lightfoot, who said the police superintendent had lied to her after he was found asleep in his car in October. He's currently the subject of an Inspector General investigation into exactly what happened on that evening. As for the weather, tonight, clear skies with a low around 8 degrees and wind chill values as low as 3 below. And tomorrow it warms up with another sunny day, taking us to a high near 37 degrees. And still to come on Chicago Tonight.
It is to provide health care to all people as a human right, not a privilege.
The gloves came off in last night's debate over health care and Medicare for all. How an annual art exhibit is impacting artists year-round. The founder of the 1619 Project talks slavery's legacy in the modern-day world. And Geoffrey Bayer on the gritty history of a now trendy Chicago neighborhood in this week's Ask Geoffrey. But first, some of today's top business headlines from Cranes. Here's Stephanie Goldberg.
When they talk on page 17, these healthcare.
Thanks, Paris. The Feds say Outcome Health founder Rishi Shah has more money than he claims. Shah, who's accused of misleading and overbilling Outcome Health customers, says he can't afford to pay for his legal defense unless the government unfreezes some of his assets. But court filings show he spent at least $1.5 million in the first 10 months of 2019. American Express charges include more than $100,000 on booze, $36,000 on yachting, and $32,000 at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Meanwhile, more banks are closing branches in Evanston. PNC Bank has closed its only branch in the northern suburb after amassing just $28 million in deposits since acquiring the location in 2018. Also announcing plans to close Evanston locations are JP Morgan Chase and BMO Harris. Those are the two largest retail banks in the Chicago area. Once the closures are finalized, there will be 18 bank branches left in Evanston. That's 10 less than the city had a decade ago. Finally, McDonald's and Starbucks customers may soon be drinking out of reusable cups. Bloomberg reports the new cups are the result of a 2-year project led by Starbucks and Chicago-based McDonald's. The cups will pilot this week in California. The two chains alone blow through billions of paper cups a year. Most are coated with a plastic lining, which makes them nearly impossible to recycle. For Crane's Chicago Business and chicagobusiness.com, I'm Stephanie Goldberg. Back to you, Paris.
Thank you, Stephanie. One particular issue keeps rising to the top of voters' concerns this primary season, that is Medicare for all. And it took center stage at the Democratic debate in Las Vegas last night. Candidates pulled no punches.
We need to get everybody's health care plan out here. Mayor Buttigieg really has a slogan that was thought up by his consultants, and Amy's plan is even less. It's like a Post-it note, insert plan here.
When you see some troubled waters, you don't blow up a bridge, you build one. And so we need to improve the Affordable Care Act, not blow it up.
UK can do it, France can do it, Germany can do it, all of Europe can do it. Gee whiz, somehow or another, we are the only major country on earth that can't do it. Why is that? And I'll tell you why. It's because last year the healthcare industry made $100 billion in profits.
I'm the only one on this stage that actually got anything done on healthcare. Okay?
Clear policy differences there among all the candidates. So what would a Medicare for all look like, and how realistic is it? Or would a tweaked Obamacare with an optional government health insurance plan have more appeal? Joining us with their insight are Dr. Claudia Fegan, the National Coordinator of Physicians for a National Health Program. It's a grassroots doctors group advocating for single-payer national health program. And Bruce Japsen, a senior contributor to Forbes and WBBM News Radio on healthcare, also the author of the book Inside Obamacare. Welcome, both of you, to Chicago Tonight. First, Dr. Fegan, it's known colloquially as Medicare for All, single-payer healthcare. What exactly would that look like?
So what we would do, it would be an expanded Medicare. If Medicare were to cover everyone, if we woke up tomorrow and everyone who lived in the United States was covered under a Medicare-like plan, a well-designed Medicare plan, without co-payments, without deductibles, because we know that co-payments and deductibles deter people from necessary care just as often as unnecessary care. That's published data from the RAND Corporation, goes back to the 70s.
And it would eliminate all private insurance regardless of whether someone wants to keep their employer-based plan or not.
Well, it would eliminate all private insurance. I find that most people are not so in love with their insurance company as they are in love with their provider, their physician, their nurse practitioner. And so I think that it's a misnomer to say everyone, if you have a plan you love, you want to keep it. Most people don't know the extent of the coverage they have until they need it. And so they don't know the limitations, and so that's one of the problems with our complicated system.
Bruce Japsen, what about the fears people have that under a single-payer system there will be rationing of care, there will be poor quality of health care, there will be lines out the door? What do you say to that?
Well, I don't know if that would necessarily be the case, because when we expanded under the Affordable Care Act, there were two things that we did. We expanded and made more people eligible for Medicaid, which is insurance for poor folks, and we also gave people subsidies to buy private coverage. That was an economic boom to the country and the state of Illinois, quite frankly, because you had more people being able to get coverage. So I don't really think people waited in lines maybe any more than they would. People would definitely have a pent-up demand for health care, which is what we found under the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. And so I don't know if that's the case. I think it would be a big change in the sense that you would be uprooting an entrenched system. We have people who get private coverage through their employers. People get Medicaid through private companies that administer it. It would be a colossal change, and there would be a lot of people that would lose their jobs in the insurance industry for sure.
Dr. Fegan, what about that point that it's such a big change? Bernie Sanders mentions hundreds of billions of dollars of industry, thousands of people employed. How do you deal with that kind of disruption?
Well, actually, we published on that. So to administer such a plan would require a lot of people who are in the insurance industry are nurses and physicians who we would need to deliver that care. So I think that we could put those people to work, and it would cost something to retrain them, but it would be more than covered by the savings by providing coverage to everyone. The complaints about we would be rationing care, we're rationing care now, but we ration care based on the ability to pay for care as opposed to based on need. It is a resource that is not infinite, but it would make more sense for us to decide what are the benefits that people need to have and provide them based on need as opposed to who can afford to pay it. We already spend enough on health care to cover everyone who lives here. We just let too many people who are not engaged in the delivery of care take profit from it.
So Bernie Sanders looks to be the only person on that debate stage that supports this single-payer idea. Bruce Jepson, you wrote a book on Obamacare. Can Obamacare be tweaked, expanded, and does it have room for a public option if people want to go that route?
Oh, sure. I mean, so one of the areas where the Supreme Court ruled, they made it optional for states to expand Medicaid. In the beginning, there were probably about half of the states that decided to take federal dollars and expand Medicaid. It was a carrot that was dangled in front of them. Now we're only down to 14 states that didn't expand Medicaid. So you could clearly, pass this, some kind of a legislation to provide more money for Medicaid. You could provide more generous subsidies for people to buy individual coverage on the exchanges. There's tax breaks to allow people to get to. You could easily expand the pool and get more people coverage through either system.
And every candidate up there does support some sort of public option, and then 68% of respondents to a new poll by the Kaiser Family Foundation say they support that. How would a public option work?
Well, a public option would essentially be a government plan that would be sold alongside for those folks who buy individual coverage on the the exchanges, the Obamacare exchanges. They would have a choice of a public plan, and that's pretty much how it would work. And then that is pretty much supported by everybody who's running on the Democratic side. And so that idea has been out there, and that actually was an idea that was floated when the Affordable Care Act was bandied about, but the insurance industry went against that, and President Obama and the Democrats at the time made a deal to allow private insurers.
Certainly faced political headwinds and would still face political headwinds. Sure. Dr. Fegan, you wrote an op-ed saying that you weren't too big a fan of Obamacare. It has not expanded coverage in the way you'd hoped.
Well, I mean, it did expand coverage for 20 million people, but even fully implemented, we leave 28 million people uninsured. And I would say that one of the fallouts of the Obamacare is that it has left a lot of people who are underinsured, people who have deductibles that are so large that they can't afford to get care and who can't afford their medications. And so it creates the illusion of coverage without really providing real coverage. I say it's a little bit like a hospital gown. It looks pretty good in the front and everything's hanging out in the back. I mean, people spend, say they have health insurance, but if they're sick or they need to access it, they can't afford it. And it's still a major cause of bankruptcy.
And there was a study put out by The Lancet that says Medicare for All single payer could save 70,000 lives and actually save $450 billion a year out of the healthcare system. How would it accomplish that?
Well, I mean, we know that every year more than 30,000 people die just as a result of not having health insurance. I mean, correcting for all of the other variables, that they die just as a result of not, because insurance in this country means access to health care. So by we level the playing field by providing everyone access to care. The preventive services that come with getting your blood pressure checked, getting your diabetes controlled, saves lives, saves dollars. It's a lot cheaper to take care of the blood pressure and control it than take care of the person after they had their stroke.
Bruce Jepson, it's clear that Americans do want lower cost prescription drugs and good care. Very quickly, what is your take on the best way to actually achieve that?
Well, part of the problem is any form of health insurance is we're moving away from a fee-for-service system. You know, you want care, you want to be able to run to the emergency room. There needs to be a re-education. People need to get on their medications. There's still, you've talked to folks up in Deerfield at Walgreens, there's still 1 in 3 people who don't take their medications when they're supposed to. So there's all sorts of things that with any of these plans are so complicated to explain. And why the plans, the companies that got into Obamacare in the beginning got out is because they were losing money because people were using the system so quickly and they weren't familiar with it. They didn't know how to use it. Now that has tempered a little bit because people are used to having insurance.
I'm sorry we have to leave it there. There's so much else to get to, but we are out of time. Dr. Fegan, Bruce Japsen, thank you very much for your views. And we're back with Brandis Friedman right after this, so please stick around.
The Museum of Science and Industry is celebrating 50 years of African-American artists at the Black Creativity exhibit. Our arts correspondent, Angel Edo, sat down with 2 featured Chicago artists to learn more about the exhibit's impact, not just during Black History Month, but year-round.
What started as a way to highlight emerging African-American artists has since grown into an annual celebration of Black fine art. This year, the Black Creativity exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry is celebrating a big milestone, 50 years.
Now, there are over 200 pieces of work ranging from digital art to sculptures to paintings, and they all sit right here in the nation's longest-running exhibition of African-American art.
The Juried Art exhibition features work from artists around the country and here in Chicago, one being based at the Blount Gallery out of the Chicago Defender building. Meet emerging artist Blake Lenoir. It's his first year in the exhibit. And while being featured here is a breakthrough for his career, Lenoir says he's also grateful for the relationships with other artists this opportunity has helped foster.
You get to see the contemporaries around you, you get to see the different types of art movements, you get to be inspired, you get to inspire others in the same way or in a different way. Different connections, like it's all more of a each one teach one, and we can all progress together, so to say. So
it's because of the Black Creativity exhibit that Lenoir was able to connect with established artist Arthur Wright, who is showcasing his work for the 4th year. He says one of his featured pieces, titled The Gift, depicts the same message the exhibit evokes, helping one another.
It's basically a collage and paint combination, and what it is showing, the visual is a woman with extended arms holding a globe, and basically this, my expression was trying to depict someone, again, sharing, someone giving of themselves freely to one another, to the world.
Lenoir's piece, Opaque Metropolis, is his own depiction of Bronzeville boys, originally created by Russell Parks. Despite meeting for the first time during this interview, both agree that this diverse community of artists reminds them that they are not alone in their challenges and also reinforces a career path that might not always be taken seriously.
At one point I was very afraid to collaborate because that meant my identity being taken away or having to share that with somebody else, when in truth, I'm learning so much. Now to me, art is all about relationships.
Absolutely.
You know,
and that's the relationships are what pay it forward for you.
Right, right. It's really important for students to understand that, and older people as well, that you're a scientist, you are a designer, you are an engineer, you are a lawyer, you're a doctor because your art heals people. Mm-hmm. You know, you're all these different things, all these different careers wrapped up in one. And you know, and then you get a chance to meet those personalities.
Exactly. You can see how what you contribute is interchangeable based on those different types of relationships with those people.
The Black Creativity exhibit works to bridge that gap between age groups by also featuring a student exhibition with work from more than 100 youth artists. When I asked Wright and Lenoir what they would say to those developing artists unsure of their craft, they had this to say.
Realize you don't have to be an artist. You can just have a hobby or an interest of doing art, which makes you happy, you know, and that will help you be good at your job.
Find your yes and also maintain a childlike disposition about what you do. Find what makes you act childlike, what makes you happy just as you were as a child.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
And if you're interested in seeing Wright and Lenoir's work, the Black Creativity exhibit is at the Museum of Science and Industry in Hyde Park through March 1st. You can visit our website for more information. And up next, we revisit my conversation with the founder of the New York Times Magazine's 1619 project. Stay with us.
Don't miss one of our stories. Get them all delivered to your desktop or mobile device with a subscription to the WTTW News Daily Briefing. Go to WTTW.com/Daily Briefing and sign up.
In 2020, the country will mark the 400th year since Pilgrims arrived, traveling on that touchstone of American history, the Mayflower. But the year before that, in 1619, a much darker period began with another ship, the White Lion. That was the first ship carrying slaves taken from Africa to arrive in the future United States of America. The New York Times Magazine's 1619 project, commemorating the 400th anniversary of slavery's beginning, argues that is the moment the America we know today actually began. The woman who led the project's creation is journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who joins us now. Welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So why did you want to create the 1619 project?
I wanted to create the project really to get at what you said in your introduction, which is that the year 1619 and that ship called the White Lion was one of the most important moments in the American story. It is a moment that is really at the basis for so much of American life, the very definition of American freedom, our culture, our politics. You can look at everything, you know, looking at traffic patterns. There's almost nothing that's been left untouched by that decision, and yet almost no American had ever heard of the year 1619. And certainly while every American child is taught about the Mayflower, almost no American children are taught about the White Lion. And I think that that was a huge oversight, and this was an opportunity to do something about that.
As you said, in a series of essays, you and several other journalists, authors, you talk about how slavery shapes everything from our economics, certainly, but also our education system, our healthcare system. You mentioned our traffic patterns. Tell me a little bit about how you and those other journalists kind of make this argument.
So what was really important to me was that in looking at this 400th anniversary, that the project not just be a history, that it was important to excavate that history, but I really wanted to get at the ongoing legacy of slavery, that slavery is not just something that happened a long time ago, that it has an impact on all Americans. And so we looked at different aspects of American life and then used history to trace those things back to slavery. So, you know, there's a piece on why there's the traffic in Atlanta is so bad. Well, that's because the highway system was not actually designed to quickly move people from place to place. The highway system was actually designed to segregate black people from white people. And you can see that in places like Chicago as well, in every American city. So we're really trying to draw these connections in surprising ways, not kind of the typical ways that we think. For instance, it's not surprising that black Americans have had a huge influence on music, but it probably is surprising that one of the reasons we're the only nations without universal health care is because of anti-black racism that develops out of slavery. So we wanted to really be able, just every story would be surprising and make this case that while we have tried to marginalize the legacy of slavery, all of our lives are touched by it every day.
Some historians have taken issue with some of the project's claims, for example, that the revolution was started to protect slavery. What's been your response to some of that criticism?
So first, let me say the project doesn't argue that the sole reason of the revolution was slavery. It does, however, using historiography, argue that one of the reasons for some of the colonies to decide to leave the Empire of Britain was to preserve slavery. My reaction to the criticism is one doesn't do a massive project like this that tries to reframe history for the average American and not expect that there is going to be debate, that there is going to be pushback. And where that debate is in good faith, I think I found it very illuminating. And I love the fact that it is making regular folks really want to engage with this history and engage with a better understanding of how we came to be what we are.
What have we been getting wrong in teaching slavery to students in schools?
Oh, we would need probably about 3 hours to talk about that. We don't teach it very well. We don't teach it very well because we're very uncomfortable. It's a shameful legacy. So for instance, we don't get nearly enough about how often enslaved people resisted. We don't get nearly enough about how much slavery drove our policy. We tend to think of the North as being the abolitionist North and the racially egalitarian North, and the South was backwards. But we don't really learn that slavery was practiced in all 13 colonies, that the North also benefited financially from slavery, that this was really a national institution. And there's a reason why it took the deadliest war in the history of our country and 700,000 lives lost to end slavery. And that's because our entire country's economic, social, and political systems were wrapped up in this institution. And so I think it's very challenging for people because we need to believe as Americans that we were a nation founded on the individual rights and liberties of men, but we were also founded on the complete enslavement and bondage of 1/5 of the population. And this project is really trying to force us to grapple with that truth.
This project is being used as a lesson in schools, including here in Chicago
Yes.
Public Schools. What do you want young people to take away from this?
I really want, shout out to Janice Jackson for implementing this. Every high school student in the Chicago Public Schools has access to this project. I think it's really important that we get a more accurate history, that we teach children to challenge the given narrative, to question, to have a understanding of the American story that is more inclusive and that is more realistic. And particularly for Black children, it is critical that they have access to a history curriculum that does not demean them, that does not erase them, that explains the circumstances that they live in. I think that that can be tremendously powerful. And as I go out and talk to people, I've engaged with high school students in Chicago who particularly have engaged with my essay, which is how Black Americans are really the perfecters of democracy. They've said how empowering it was because they never heard any of this before and had really been raised to believe that Black Americans had not contributed very much to this country, and that's absolutely false. So when you open the project, nearly every piece is written by Black Americans. And to me, it was critical to show all of the talent that is shaping our country, who are made up of people who descended from the enslaved and are now in a position to write these words in the New York Times, the paper of record, that in and of itself is a testament to the ancestors. And I thought that was a very important part of the project, that it needed to be the people who descended from the enslaved who told the stories of this legacy.
And despite the success of those descendants, of course, you have to talk about how in the last 400 years, you say the country has maintained this racial caste system through racial terrorism. Do you think that still happens today?
Provocative. To a degree, of course. I mean, we're in Chicago. All Americans got to see what happened with Laquan McDonald. The fact that Black people are the most likely to be unarmed and shot by the police. The fact that you can look at across the city of Chicago, one of the most segregated cities in the country, where the concentrated poverty that Black people experience leads to a tremendous amount of violence. So I don't think we could argue in any way that we have rid ourselves of the racial caste system. The level of violence, of course, is not the same. I mean, the type of violence that Black people experienced after the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement was profound and intense and never ending. But in almost every other way, we see the maintenance of the caste system. You see it here in your schools, you see it here in your unemployment rates, you see it here in healthcare outcomes, really in every part that you can measure. And it doesn't matter that you're in a so-called progressive city. White Americans, no matter their politics, in many ways are maintaining the caste system.
What hope do you have for the future of race relations in this country?
I'm not a hopeful person.
No hopes.
I mean, I have hopes, but I don't think that they'll come true. I mean, of course, my hope is that we would be able to purge ourselves of our original sin. And our original sin is introducing a system of racial caste. But I don't think that that's possible. I mean, the whole point of the 1619 Project is that slavery and a racial caste system predates the founding of our country by 150 years. It is embedded in the very DNA of who we are as a country. And the only times we've seen real forward progress on that has been during revolutionary periods. Revolutionary periods are sustained periods of violence that force a restructuring of society. So I don't think that we are ever going to be able to rid ourselves of this legacy, but we certainly cannot rid ourselves if we're not truthful about it and if we don't confront the truth of it.
Oh, I could ask you more questions, but I will have to leave it there. Nicole Hannah-Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Fulton Market in Chicago's West Loop is home today to some of the city's trendiest restaurants and highest rents. But the area's history as an economic powerhouse is hardly anything new. Geoffrey Bayer takes us back in this week's edition of Ask Geoffrey. Hey, Geoffrey.
Hello, Brandis.
So this question comes from Ray Dempsey. He asks, I used to own several buildings in the Fulton Market neighborhood. Can you tell us about the history of the area, especially since the neighborhood has just exploded in recent years?
Well, and as you pointed out, today we know of that West Loop area for all those high-end restaurants, loft condominiums, corporate headquarters like Google and McDonald's are all there. And this is, of course, a far cry from the area's former life when it was an integral part of Chicago's meat packing industry, where animals were processed and sold wholesale in large quantities. In fact, the buildings that our question asker once owned are the oldest meat packing buildings in the district. The one-time home of the Fulton Street Wholesale Market Company. They're located across the street from each other on Fulton between Green and Peoria Streets. These buildings once housed dozens of meat wholesalers, and you can see in this illustration, which was published shortly after the building opened in 1887, these companies sold things like dressed beef, hogs, and veal. They sold their wares to hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, butchers. They even, which was common in those days, sold the pelts and the hides as well. The meatpacking and wholesale industry really boomed in this West Loop area over the next few decades. Several dozen additional companies popped up across the neighborhood. Look at this view of Fulton wholesale buildings. This one came from 1955. Organized chaos. So it was in these buildings that our question asker's father, Ray Dempsey Sr., worked as what was called a stationary engineer, which means he took care of the boiler in the building. His son, Ray Jr., eventually owned the buildings, among those, including the ones that his father had worked in as an engineer. He owned them for a few years in the mid-1980s.
So how was Fulton Market related to the Chicago stockyards on the south side?
Yes, right, of course. So the stockyards on the south side were really the center of industrial scale meat packing in the city. Bridgeport, back of the yards, South Branch of the Chicago River, famous for making Chicago hog butcher for the world, in the words of Carl Sandburg. So Fulton Market, up on the sort of north side, west of the Loop, was mostly made up of smaller independent meat packers and wholesalers, although pretty early on some of the major companies from the stockyards like Armour and Swift also set up locations on Fulton Street to expand their distribution. The area was a natural fit for these companies because just a few blocks south of Fulton is Randolph Street, which was once the home to a massive open-air produce market that supplied much of Chicago's fresh food. Randolph Street's history as a market goes almost all the way back to the beginnings of Chicago. In the 1850s, the city built a structure there circled in red there called the West Market Hall, which was right in the middle of Randolph Street at Des Plaines in 1850. That building spawned a sprawling wholesale market that attracted both local farmers and other companies to Randolph Street, and that led to the construction of permanent wholesale buildings known as, they were called commission houses. And like its neighbor, of course, on Fulton Street, many of those businesses are gone, but they have left their permanent mark on the neighborhood. So think about this. If you've ever been down to Randolph Street, go into restaurants and so forth, look how wide that is. So you'll notice it's very wide. With expanded lanes on either side, and that's because the street was widened several times around the turn of the century to accommodate all those trucks and wagons and things that were frequenting the wholesale warehouses. This went all the way to Ogden Avenue from Des Plaines.
And today, most of these buildings have been totally repurposed.
Absolutely. Starting in the 1980s and 90s, the neighborhood saw a huge influx of restaurants and other companies moving to the Loop. Many people cite when Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Studios moved to Randolph and May Streets in 1989 as kind of the start of the neighborhood change. Some of the city's top restaurants can be found along Randolph and Fulton today. And then, as we said before, huge companies like Google have set up shop in the area. McDonald's recently moved their headquarters to the former site of Oprah Winfrey's studios. That building was torn down. McDonald's headquarters were built there. But believe it or not, there are actually still a few meatpacking companies around. Many of them have deep roots in the area, like this one, Kugel Commission Company and Pioneer Meatpacking Company. They still pack and sell lamb, veal, poultry, and other products. And I have to give a shameless plug here. We actually will be featuring this West Loop area in my new upcoming show, Chicago by L, which is going to be debuting on March 4th on WTTW.
We're looking forward to that. It kind of makes sense that this community, it's Restaurant Road, still providing a lot of food to Chicagoans.
Yes, absolutely. So, retail now.
Retail now, yes. Thank you so much, Geoffrey.
Sure thing.
And you can learn more about the history of Fulton Market on our website. And while you're there, be sure to submit your own questions about Chicago to Geoffrey Baer. And we're back with more right after this.
Ask Geoffrey is made possible in part by BMO Harris Bank.
Wow, you ready?
Yeah, let me just grab my wallet.
Uh-oh, I've seen this before. Wallet way too big, skinny jeans too skinny.
I'll just carry it.
Before you break something, you should know you don't actually need a wallet. With BMO Harris, you can just take cash out with your phone. Or if you need to, you can pay them with Zelle.
That works?
Yeah. You're stuck, aren't you?
Smile.
Woo! Those jeans are way too tight.
That feeling you get when no wallet is no big deal. That's the BMO effect.
And that's our show for this Thursday night.
Please join us tomorrow night, live at 7 for the Weekend Review. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.